So here you are on the other seat.
Yes.
And
I can tease you.
You can tease me, and I can probably ask you very awkward questions.
Yes. We've been rehearsing particularly awkward questions that you could ask me.
So why the two poems? First of all, why the Shelley?
I mean, I love Shelley very much. Shelley hasn't been much of an influence on my writing. I don't think he's much of an influence on anybody anymore. He's strangely gone out of fashion. I think Wallace Stevens is the sort of last great poet to be influenced by Shelley. There's something about Shelley's uplift and passion and outspokenness, and you hear it in that poem, that declamatory thing. It's terribly unfashionable now. You're supposed to mumble and apologise and say, I'm not great, really. Whereas Shelley wants to grab you and say, come on, we can change the world. And everyone's embarrassed by that now. It's a terrible shame. There's actually one poem with a reference to Shelley, but no one's got it so far. So, but the reason I asked for it is that I particularly asked David Mitchell to read it because not long after I was ordained, when I was 20... I wasn't. I was 32. I'm not great on age, am I? I'm not great on anything that involves numbers. So, but strangely, I'm attracted to them like a moth to flame. Anyway, I don't know how that happens, but it's got worse. I remember talking to David Mitchell and I were in Australia together. I was accompanying him, and I said that T.S. Eliot was a much greater poet than Shelley. I'd never read any Shelley, but I like to have opinions. I still do, actually. And David Mitchell, who has read Shelley, said, "Don't be ridiculous." I said, "No, he's a much greater poet." And then, fortuitously, he sort of took down a volume from the shelf nearby. We were in Melbourne, I think, and he opened it and read the first five verses of The Mask of Anarchy. And I just thought, oh, wow. I mean, he read it in David Mitchell's blood-curdling... So it's not possibly how you'd read Eliot. But I really thought, wow, I've never come across anything like it. It was... I didn't know you could do that. It was one of those moments in life where I was speechless, which is for me is quite something. I just thought, that is incredible. I didn't know that was possible. So I then went off and read all of Shelley, and I read Michael Holmes. Is it Michael Holmes? Richard Holmes. Marvellous biography of Shelley, The Pursuit, which is like a thriller in itself. I then, because Shelley met Keats, I read all of Keats and Gittins' biography of Keats, and then Keats, of course, I wanted to go back to Coleridge. I read all of Coleridge, and Keats refer back to Dante, so I read all of Dante. I got a bit lost there. I didn't know where to go after Dante. Heaven's a bit boring, just if you're thinking of reading it. Too much abstract theologising. So that really I wanted to have the Shelley read, mainly because it started me reading properly. So for many years I just read. I've only finally just now gotten to Milton, which is very late. But it was David Mitchell that introduced me to the real thing. I mean, a much greater poet than Eliot, who I tend to think is a bit overrated, although he's wonderful. But a bit not as wonderful as people think. Anyway, that's another one of my opinions.
No, thank you. And what about The Frost?
Well, The Frost is a direct influence on my writing, on poetry. Again, I discovered Frost only relatively recently. I remember I was in New Zealand with Gary, who's here, and I was reading a set of interviews with Seamus Heaney, wonderful set of interviews. I can't remember who interviews him. Can you remember me? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Huh? Dennis O'Driscoll, yeah, very wonderful interviews with Heaney. Yeah. And he kept on talking about Frost. Yeah. And I trust Heaney's opinion. Yeah. I trust Heaney's voice, You can't help it. You have to read a few poems of Heaney and you trust him. So I thought I must go off and read Frost. When I first read them, the great collection is North of Boston, his second collection. when I first read them, I thought, yeah, nice enough. If you read them, particularly the long narratives, which I've come to love the most, you can read them and fine. They use this very, very natural English. It's very conversational. This is a monologue, so you get donuts and soda biscuits and I don't know, and stops in the language. But as you read them more deeply, I mean, for a start off, they're incredibly crafted. And they're crafted so wonderfully that you don't notice the craft. He's very much a sort of disciple of Wordsworth. You can go from Wordsworth straight to Frost, and he's got Wordsworth's grasp of the craft. So they're in perfect pentameter, but modulated so exquisitely. I brought it because it's a shame we couldn't have the whole thing, but we wouldn't have got to me. And, I did actually want to get to me. I didn't make you know how glad I was to have you come and camp here on our land. Why, that is so beautiful. I didn't make you know how glad I was to have you come and camp here on our land. And it's nearly all in monosyllables. I didn't make you know how glad I was to have you come and camp here on our land. I promised to myself to get down someday and see you the way you lived, but I don't know. With a house full of hungry men to feed, I guess you'd find, it seems to me, I can't express my feelings any more than I can raise my voice. It's perfect, isn't it? And it just does that the whole way through, gradually takes you into this terribly tragic monologue, incredible piece of writing, I think. But if you read it slightly, you can just think, yeah, nice enough. But it's perfect. And the sound is gorgeous. How does he do it? So straightforward. The language is just like, da-da-da-da, it's like he's talking in a bath. And yet it's just perfect. And for me, that's become a kind of benchmark of writing. To write that clearly, that unfussily, that straightforwardly, that emotionally, but that well.
Good, thank you. Let's come on to you. So, before we move on to yarn, I just thought it'd be good to just hear a little bit about how you started writing poetry particularly. Because, in your younger days, you thought of yourself as an artist, as a painter. And that if anything, when you had more time, you'd paint. You'd go off and paint. And it seemed to be time and lack of room in the community that stopped you from painting rather than anything else. Poetry seemed to come in, did it come in late in life or not?
It sort of snuck in, didn't it? I mean, when I first got involved with the Buddhist Centre here, I was at Goldsmiths Art College, studying fine art, which is far too grand a term for what we did, but some of us actually painting things. And, the rest of us burnt rubber tyres and things like that, and did something on a computer. So, that when I got involved, I got involved from there. I was at the second year of art college at the time. I had always written poems. Like, I remember writing a poem when I was very young, about 7, and I remember my aunt not believing that I'd written it. I even remember it was called The Hazelnut Tree, because we had a hazelnut tree in the garden, and my auntie Pat just didn't believe I'd written it. I never had an adult disbelieve me when I was telling the truth before. And I just said, no, but I did. And she just didn't believe me. I don't think that wounded me for life or anything like that. I was kind of fine. It was maths that was the problem. Nobody needed me to write poems, so we were fine, But adding up did seem necessary. So I, and like lots of people, I'd written poems when I was miserable, which were basically, I'm miserable, and a robin is singing. I mean, they're not unlike that.
I wasn't invited.
No, don't say so. No. I'll say it for you. I know what he's thinking. I mean, they're hardly a laugh a minute now. I gave a reading recently. It was so miserable. I said I'm actually quite funny in life.
There are a couple that are slightly humorous.
Very slightly.
Very slightly. They make you smile.
Yes, good. Thanks for that. Where was I? Yes. So I'd always written them when I was miserable, as you do. I'm feeling miserable, a robin singing, end of poem. And then, or a robin singing, and I'm feeling miserable. But that was a basic thing. Just to rearrange that. And then I was on a sabbatical retreat trying to write a book about Buddhism and art. As you he stopped me. He came to visit me on this retreat. And I spent, this is a painful story that is wounding, I spent 3 months intensively, mostly on my own, writing this book on Buddhism and art, which I had been meaning to do for years and years and years. I've worked really hard about it. I wasn't enjoying writing at all. Iota Shots came halfway through and read the manuscript, read the manuscript, came back and he said, "I'm not impressed by the manuscript or by you." This is after 3 months on my own. And it was one of those, I couldn't answer, because even though...
I said it with a little bit more kindness.
No, that is word for word. It stayed with me all this time. But it was one of those times where someone tells you the truth, a painful truth, and I knew immediately it was right. I'd been struggling to write this wretched book. So I said, okay, I won't do any more on it. He said, I think you should stop writing it. I think you should meditate more. Any thoughts? Just stop, So I stopped. I've never looked at that book since. I've even lost the manuscript now. I never looked. I didn't look at it again. I started writing poems more. I started meditating more. I started painting more, and I actually became happy, which I'd forgotten. I think it was that Iota Shots was alluding to. But you know what it's... I mean, especially someone like me, I'm a very ambitious person. Ambition is always... there's something ugly about it, and there's always something compensatory about ambition. It's to do with not being very comfortable in yourself. So, I stopped writing this wretched book. And I wrote more poems, and really enjoyed that. Because I didn't know what I was writing. I had never written poems. I remember this is the first time I typed them up. This was only in 2005, I think. And then I sent some to Vishvantra when I got home, because Vishvantra, she's very nifty. She'd not long won Poetry London at that time, I remember. Anyway, I sent them to Vishvantra, and one of the turning points in this was when Vishvantra left a message on my answering machine saying, "I've just read the poems, they're wonderful, you must come round and talk to me about them." I remember playing it to David Mitchell, actually. One of those answers, one of those machines that you want to save. There isn't a save function here. And I only needed like a tuppence of encouragement. You've tried not to, haven't you? Quite successfully.
I sort of gave birth to you as a poet.
Did you?
Well, in a way, by stopping you writing that wretched book.
Oh, yes, of course. It was a painful birth. Anyway, Vishvantra and I started meeting very regularly. Vishvantra, I sent her a great big wad of these wretched things. And Vishvantra very kindly went through them all. I remember her crossing out a last line once, and I remember her putting a line through it and saying, "I think it finishes here." I got terribly excited. And then the next turning point, of course, was when I went on an Arvon teaching week. Oh no, it wasn't. I got third place in this competition. And at this competition, it said you can come along and do this workshop. And it was led by Mimi, so it was the first time I met Mimi. And I remember Mimi very well, and I remember being very, very quiet. And I remember being actually, frankly, slightly horrified, because I cycled over from the Buddhist Centre thinking, this is nice, I'm getting away from Buddhists for a change. I mean that in a nice way. And we were sitting around this table and there were all these earnest faces. I thought, oh no, not more. I thought I'd got away from earnest faces. And there we were, all apart from Mimi, but there was this little moment there. I read out one of my poems and Mimi said, she's very encouraging, Mimi, but she's tough as iron. She said, yeah, it's good. She said, have you been reading Marianne Moore? I said, oh yeah, I have. She said, yes, you can tell. I think it's getting... And I was like, wow. Wow, She said, I think it's getting in the way of this poem. I think, ease off Marianne Moore. Because I'd been reading Marianne Moore very much, and everything I wrote sounded like Marianne Moore. And then I went on this Arvon course, and then cut a long story short, it's quite a long story, isn't it? So I won this mentoring, and I was mentored by Mimi. And then I won another mentoring. In fact, I won Mimi 3 times, which was, such good fortune. And outside the Dharma, I've never learned so much from one person outside the Dharma. If my Buddhist teacher, Bhante, my beloved teacher, Bhante, but my poetry teacher is Mimi. And for me, teacher is in the old sense of teacher, who teaches you, who leads you, who can say no to you, who draws out the best in you. In a way, the poet I've been most influenced is not Frost or Shelley or Elizabeth Bishop, whoever else, but Mimi. We've been meeting regularly, haven't we, for quite a few years now. And everything I've learnt about form, everything I've learnt about the craft of poetry, but that sounds too technical, as if the craft is separate from the feeling or separate from the poem, capital P. Everything about that I've learnt from Mimi. I've dedicated the book to Mimi. I've dedicated the last book to Mimi. She's the poet I've learnt most from.
No, thank you. Let's come on to this then, yarn. So, it's for those of you who've not looked at it yet. It's divided into 4 very distinct sections, and I thought we'd start with the section the yard.
Yeah.
The yard is that's where you particularly talk about your childhood. I was very, very struck by some of the poems about your father in particular. I wondered if you could say a little bit about, or if you want to, your sort of relationship with your father, who's no longer living.
No.
I was very struck by, for example, the last poem about him, where it's your most unlikely son, and a sense of not belonging, and yet obviously a very heartfelt connection and love for your father.
Yes, yeah.
I wonder if you can say anything more about this sense of not quite belonging, and yet your family are obviously very alive in the book, important in the book.
My father, I feel such love for my father, but I come from a large family. I have 3 older brothers and a younger sister, and my brothers are much more blokey than me, and even my sister is a bit more blokey.
She's not watching this.
I mean, I only joking. I'll get it in the neck for that one. And I was very, very unhappy as a child. My brothers were very cruel to me as a child. Systematically cruel for a long, long time. And I don't sort of begrudge them. It's just, I don't know, that was the part they had to play, and I had to play the part of a sensitive boy, which I was terribly sensitive and dreadfully oversensitive. As an adult, I know what it's like now to have someone who whinges all the time and cries all the time. It's such a... my mother used to say, "What's the matter now?" And I used to say, and she said to me many years later, she said, "We really just didn't understand you." I felt like I just came from another world to my family. My brothers are all strapping lads, and they were all very happy. My sister is always happy. She still is. She's got this lovely, very, very settled temperament. She's like my grandmother. Really. She's got this beautiful kind of good nature and sanity about her. I was always so upset. Everything upset me. Nearly all these photographs of us, there's all my brothers. There's my sister, who's got this lovely round face. You just her whole face. There would be me in the middle crying, and looking cold, or I was terribly thin. I mean, my story about it was that I nearly died when I was born. I had gastroenteritis, and the doctors didn't diagnose it, and I was I was very badly dehydrated by the time I went to hospital. And for a while they were really frightened that I'd die. And I was a week in hospital. I was only like 2 or something, or 1 or something like that. And my mother must have found it agonising having me in hospital. And I still remember my parents feeling very protective about me. For instance, I remember very, very early on, they didn't want me to do the chores. My brothers would have to wash up, and my mother said, no, Ian doesn't have to wash up. And I remember thinking, I'll get into trouble for that. I really thought this is, I liked it because I liked the attention, but I also knew I was going to get into trouble for that. So I was a very sickly, terribly upset child, really. I don't really understand it. It still sort of hangs around for me, this sort of inner sense of lack and sort of... my poor old family couldn't make anything of me. My brothers are terribly sort of apologetic for it now. And crikey, if you ever met us, we look like photocopies. As we got older, we just looked like 3 versions of the same person, 4 versions of the same person. They want maths again. I have to be so careful. So I was very much an outsider. My father was very much like my brothers, I think. He's a very big man, my father, and a slightly frightening man. He used to have a terrible temper when I was young, but it sort of lost. By the time it got to me, he'd lost it. He was much tougher on my oldest brother, particularly. By the time it got to me, he's sort of like whatever, By the time you got 5 under 15-year-olds in the house, we didn't have very much money. We were all. My mother remembers scrambling around a drawer trying to find 50p to go and buy some bread. We were all noisy. We were always falling out. But my father's my relationship with my father is sort of complicated. I can't really quite understand how. As I got older, especially as I became a Buddhist, my relationship with him deepened no end. I really sort of identified against him when I was young, but I remember once, for instance, quoting Shelley to him, and he'd quote the next line. And I'd go into his shed. When it took us ages to realise he was dead, we just thought he was in the shed for longer. He'd been in the shed all the time. He was, where's your dad? He's in the shed. And we'd have to have this thing where you call him down for supper, and you'd always have to do it 10 minutes before supper. And then we'd say, it's on the table, which of course he knew full well that it wasn't. And then we'd
do that with you.
Yeah, you do actually, don't you? I've got more and more like him. Anyway, and I spend more time in the shed. And I remember talking to Marla about it to him before he died. But he still sort of haunts me, my father. With great love, actually, now. I feel that with my brothers as well. I feel such love for them. Slightly I find it slightly overwhelming sometimes, meeting my brothers. It was so difficult, but I feel such love for them, and my sister.
And that comes through, I think, in
I hope
the
so,
poetry.
yeah. I don't want to blame anyone for anything.
Yeah. In a way, I'd like to dwell more on that, but I want to move on just as of time to some of the other sections. So there's the Travellers from Orissa, which, as the first section, it seems to me, particularly that poet, the Travellers from Orissa, feels such a central poem in this collection. And it's your most explicitly Buddhist collection of poems.
Yeah, it is,
the Buddhist in all sorts of ways. It's very, very personal at times, isn't it? Very, very personal, confessional, courageous, very, very honest and revealing about your own practice and your own struggles with practice. And then also you've got, these 2 narrative poems in that section, which are, interesting, they're incredible. The Cattle Farmer's Tale, and then the Travellers from Orissa. The Travellers from Orissa, where, I remember you first hearing that line, and I wondered if you could sort of introduce us a little bit to that poem. Maybe you'll read from it a little later. And the Cattle Farmer's Tale, where the Buddha really does appear and feels very, very much a presence in that narrative. I wondered if you could say a little bit about, in a way, writing more explicitly Buddhist poems, whether they're sort of internal experiences of meditation or more inspired by canonical sources.
I mean, certainly some of the poems are, explicit poems about meditation. But yes, it's a much more explicitly Buddhist collection. I sort of almost tried not to write Buddhist poems because I don't like spiritual poems very much. When, say, if someone says this is a spiritual poem, I think, oh no, hold your horse. I don't like anyone trying to improve me, especially in a poem of all forms. But of course, at the same time, I would have dearly loved to write explicitly Buddhist poems, but you can't just look at a sutra and say, yeah, I could imagine that in pentameter. So both of them happened by accident. So I was listening to a talk here by Subhuti, who's, after Bhante Sangharakshita, my beloved teacher, is my beloved teacher. He was my public preceptor. I've sat at his feet and taken notes for 25 years, for longer than that. Anyway, he was giving a talk about the Buddha's enlightenment. By the time you've been practicing the Dharma as long as I have, you sort of think you know it all, at least you know the stories. And he said, I just want to tell the story of the travellers from Orissa. And just that phrase, the travellers from Orissa, you just think, wow, that is a title, isn't it? The travellers from Orissa. And as soon as I heard that phrase, I thought there is a poem somewhere in the universe called The Travellers from Orissa. There just has to be. So I was like, and I hadn't heard the story before. I don't know how. It's not terribly well known, but it's not unknown. I hadn't heard the story before. So he told the story, and I went up, I think that night, and started writing out in a tiny little notebook that I had, because I used to try and write in tiny little notebooks so I didn't write long things. Anyway, get a smaller one again, you could ask for. Yeah. So I started writing out. I thought at first it might be, I don't know, I had a different form in mind. Started writing it out, and I wrote a section, and then I remember taking it to see Mimi, and she said, I think it wants to be longer. The narrative finished in the middle of the narrative. She said, I think it actually wants to be a whole narrative. And I thought, well, I haven't got anything else. I don't know what happens next. So it's a really interesting experience of, I've written the first section. This is like 6 years ago, something like that. I've written the first section. No idea what I wanted to say, no idea what the drama was, just this voice. Tapusa said the oxen stood stock still and wouldn't budge, although we slapped their haunches, dragged their stubborn necks. And that's almost word for word what I originally wrote down. Tapusa said the oxen stood stock still and wouldn't budge. And somehow out of that first line, Tapusa said the oxen stood stock still and wouldn't budge, came the whole, I had to find why is Barlick talking like this? What happened? What does he have to say? Took me forever to do it. I rather poor Mimi saw it so many times that she must be bored stiff of it. The last thing I did and we did really was take out some commas, but I really thought I'd never finish it. It was started long before the Crumb Road, the first collection. I even didn't publish it. I could have published it then, but had a vague feeling it didn't fit in the collection, and it might not have been right, and I was right, it wasn't right. Yeah, so...
It really is an extraordinary poem, as I've read it and reread it. I mean, I've read earlier versions of it.
Right, yes,
but,
of course.
It sort of creeps up on you, the pathos, the sadness. It's a terribly sad poem.
Terribly sad, yeah.
And one of the things that happens both in this poem and in some of the other more explicit Buddhist poems is, well, this sense of loss, this sense of absence in a way. Yeah. The Buddha's sort of absent for most of the travellers from Orissa. There's a man who's telling a tale from memory, but also this sense of opportunities lost, and that somehow you've managed to make that into a transcendent emotion or hint at something beyond through the absence. I wonder if you can, was that something conscious, or is that?
I mean, it's well known now that writing positively is, in a certain sense, easier to write it negatively. To say, this didn't happen, this didn't happen, this didn't happen, and of course, whilst you're saying it didn't, you're actually also saying this. You're sort of evoking it. Yes. I don't think I did it for that reason.
Yes.
It wasn't by that I don't read contemporary poetry and think, oh, I see, this is how you do it now.
Yes.
But you have this instinct that you can't do it like Shelley.
Yes.
You can't say the Buddha but he saw that. You just can't do it like that. You just, I don't know why quite. It'd be lovely if you could. I just doesn't feel like you can't speak like that.
But it also feels a uniquely sort of, perhaps it's not uniquely Buddhist, but it does feel a Buddhist sensibility to look at that absence and turn that into a yearning.
Yes.
A yearning for something more, which then becomes a wholly sort of positive experience.
Yes, I hope so. I mean, part of writing poetry, you have to be unconscious.
Yeah.
You can't be too conscious, and I really wanted. I hope that that absence evokes a presence, but not a presence in the Christian sense. It's not. The Buddha isn't someone you can literally pray to, but he's not absent either. You want to say yes and no at the same time. There's one poem later in the collection where I sort of, in one verse, say yes and one verse say no. And I don't mean that the answer's no. I want them read almost together. And if you could say yes and no together and find a transcending third. And I'm hoping that by how I've written, that somehow by saying no, that I can find him. But if I said the Buddha and the Buddha, that's not right. It's not the Buddha.
Easy.
It's too easy, and it's not the Buddha. He's not a literal figure that you can ask for him to help you. You can, but not in that way that we've grown used to in the West. It's not a supernatural figure that you can phone up. However you want to sort of persitize that. That's not true. But he's not absent either. That's not true either. And we're too keen on absence, I think.
This thread of yearning, as well as this thread of loss, runs through the whole collection, doesn't it? So it's a very strong kind of unifying thread. It's there in the Crumb Road, but it's particularly there, I think, in Yarn. It's there in, there's a whole section called April Elegies, poems written for Mahananda after Mahananda's death. And they really do, again, evoke something of that man. Particularly this sort of, the more tragic side of Mahananda, although you've got an afterthought at the end of that section.
Just to manage to pull the plane up.
Indeed, but it starts, that section, doesn't it, with his ordination. So you privately ordained Mahananda.
That's right,
It starts with the giving of the name.
Yeah.
And it almost ends with his ordination, the private ordination. And I just wondered if you could say something about what it's like to write so personally about something, a dear friend who's died, somebody who you ordained, somebody who you gave his name to, in a ceremony that is private and normally not talked about, let alone written about. I wondered if you could say something about.
It's rather poignant even talking about Mahananda now, because we had his funeral here in this room, I was sitting there, the body was here. At first I felt sort of bad about writing about Mahananda, because, it's something, I don't know, I always find it unseemly to write about a friend that's just died. I started a first poem the morning after, lying in bed, I remember reading Heaney saying it was all right to do that. I don't know whether it is or not.
To me, they don't feel exploitative in any way at all.
That's always the fear, that you use, tragedy as lucrative poem making, and it's quite despicable.
A fitting memorial to him.
That's what I wanted. I didn't sort of mean to write them, and they've been coming over 5 years. So again, the earliest ones predate the last collection.
Yes.
But what I wanted to do, what I realised at one point is that this is a sequence of poems I'm writing.
Yeah.
In my mind, it echoes a Stephen
sequence
in the Crumb Road. Yeah. This is a sequence about a friend in adulthood.
Yes.
The Stephen sequence is about a pre-sexual relationship with a boy when I was a child. Again, I didn't write it for that reason, but it came to echo that. And then I realised I was writing a sequence. I remember being in the shower thinking, I'm writing a sequence. And then I thought, if I'm writing a sequence about Mahananda, I need to tell you my relationship with him. Yeah. One of the challenges of writing poems is you do need to say you do need to do all those plot things, who they are, who I am. You can't leave all that out, I don't think. You shouldn't. I think it's a weakness if you do. And then, as I thought that, I had this line, when I told you your name, you wept aloud. And thanks to my schooling with Mimi, I immediately knew that was a rhyming sonnet, the first line of a rhyming. When I told you your name, you wept aloud. Aloud sounds like a rhyme word to me. Cloud, when I told you your name, I knew it was a pentameter line. It literally sort of ticker-taped through my mind. When I told you your name, you wept aloud. And of course that doesn't need to mean about ordination, but it could mean all sorts of things. I told you your real name when I, and then of course that meant then I wrote writing more, and I realised I hadn't said about the name. So, so what I tried to do in the sequence was put the whole of Mohananda's life and his mother's life in the sort of Japanese screens of the ordination, as if it's all taking place in the private ordination.
Yes.
Because his mother, who I knew quite well, she was in Auschwitz.
Yes.
You know, I remember when I first met her, seeing the tattoo on her wrist, and I remember because I went to talk to her about why I thought it was a good idea for Mohananda to work in a cafe that we'd started. I had a friend and I started a Buddhist cafe, and I asked Mohananda to join it. He had, when he was young, he'd been trained to be a doctor. So I went to meet her to try and convince her that it was a good idea. Boy, was I out of my depth. Like every argument was like, no, it was like ninja. And eventually I sort of staggered away, being completely trounced by it. She was a wonderful woman, you know, with a terrible, terrible life. And as soon as you remember Mohananda, you have to remember his mother. You therefore remember European history, basically.
Yes, which you actually touch on his mother's Sophia, for example.
Yeah, that's a poem about the dream I had about Mohananda.
Yeah. And then I just want to move on to the last section, and always somewhere.
And always.
So this, for me, in some ways, was it presented some of the most sort of surprising poems, particularly Aaron's Brother.
Right. Yeah.
And when I first read Aaron's Brother, I kind of thought, what is he doing, and why is this poem in here at all? It's a long narrative poem again, but of quite a different style, content to. I mean, you've got Frost there, but it's a monologue, isn't it? But I wonder if you can say a little bit about. Well, maybe I'll just say how I've come to read it now is...
Because you didn't like it at first.
I didn't like it at first, I must admit. But I've come to read it as a sort of continuation of this whole theme about spirituality and its loss. It's almost like, the lines from Dover Beach came to mind. The sea of faith and the melancholy long withdrawing roar. And you've got the Travellers of Orissa with the loss being very, very poignant, very, very sad, but also redemptive. Yeah. And then you've got Aaron's Brother at the other end. I don't know if this is just me making this up, but Aaron's Brother at the other end where it's turned sour. Yeah. Religion has turned rather, sour, poisonous even.
Yeah, poisonous.
And I wondered if you wanted to say, well, why that, and was that conscious, that sort of thread?
I mean, you never quite know why the poem, you know. I mean, it's supposed to be a poisonous poem.
It's certainly dark.
You know, you're supposed to be inveigled into it, and then, you know, and I'd always wanted to write one of those monologues where it is like a scene from a play, where you're actually talking to a person that's supposed to be there, who doesn't answer back, and then of course that silence becomes more and more. You have to manage how it is that he's not answering back, and why is it that at the end he can't speak. You know, somewhere I had the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner in my mind somewhere vaguely, but again, it's a complex poem, and it's a Christian poem. In my mind, it's set in late Victorian Cornwall. You know, in that kind of world, it's slightly also trying to be the sort of poem that Wordsworth couldn't have written. You know, telling you about the things underneath that, the skin of traditional Christianity. It's not trying to have a go at Christianity. I'm not trying to criticise it. It's really a poem about spiritual jealousy, about the corroding influence of that. It's a poem about the unexpressed, resentment and seduction. Spirituality, religious life is a sort of seduction in a certain sort of way, but that seduction can go wrong. I think there is something, as what you say, about this sort of this loss of faith and how faith can turn sour. The whole question of faith is a major question, isn't it? we have to have faith in something. We've said we don't now, at least in this little tiny patch of land. Actually, God is making a huge comeback, and he's really cross. You know, ever since Nietzsche killed him, he's been in a really bad mood, and he's, as I was saying today, that he's coming back, and now this time it's personal. You know, but in our tiny patch of land, we've decided no, we don't need faith. We need a secular world. And the secular world is just not deep enough. It's not. We're too big for a secular world. But you see the problem of faith, and then you think, okay, so let's go for a belief of God and so on, and it so easily gets distorted, literalized, and of course, from my perspective, any belief in God is literalized and sort of
and
distorting and therefore dangerous, because you've got a figure that can actually tell you what to do. You mix up myth with history. You've got a very, very dangerous thing where you've got that kind of literalized deity who created you and will punish you. And then I think what you get out of that is dreadful repressions. But still, even with those people, a real yearning sometimes for something transcendent. It's not as simple as that. And in the poem, I've tried to keep.
Yes, it's ambiguous.
I don't want it to be a simple matter, because I don't think it is. I've known, one of the women that brought me up, Jane, who's I've written a poem about. She was very, very passionately a Christian, and I remember really admiring her even when I was a child. I thought she had something, but I've never believed in God and never could do.
I wonder. I mean, we're nearly out of time, but I don't know if you can say more, coming back to you more personally, what effect writing has had on your spiritual practice, on your spiritual life. How you, because it's not always been completely straightforward.
No.
You're writing about very, well at times, as I say, meditational experiences, confessional experiences. It's obviously, everything seems to be imbued with experience that you've had from, and that of course is imbued with the Dharma life that you've lived for 25 years or more. But it also then has a reciprocal effect on that spiritual life, on that yearning for transcendence. I wonder if you can say something about what that effect.
I mean, partly one thing I never regret about poetry is it's made me read so. Made me read such wonderful. I was rereading Wallace Stevens just recently, and don't know what he's talking about, but my gosh, it's just gorgeous. It's fantastic. So I've really valued that. I mean, the negative side of it, let's not go on about it, but it's sort of, it reawoken my ambition, and that's.
It's cheaper than putting on operas, isn't
It
it?
is cheaper, yeah. I did an opera last time. Jan of Archer was very pleased when I took the poetry.
I was, yes.
It didn't need a budget.
Did he bankrupt the centre?
Yeah. Another story. So it's reawoken my ambition, but luckily in a cheaper way, more transportable way. I think it's improved my teaching.
Yes, I think it's to say that.
I think it's enriched my language and improved my teaching, improved my sense of. Because you're always, as Eliot says, I'm always using words when I speak to you.
Sure.
You're trying to use those as well as possible. Yeah. Poetry is only sort of frozen speech. Yeah. It's Eliot's, Auden's definition, isn't it? Of poetry is memorable speech. Yeah. And surely teaching the Dharma, teaching Buddhism needs to be memorable speech. I'm sure meeting the Buddha was memorable speech.
Yeah.
And of course the Buddha was always aware that he was using words.
Yeah.
He was always using words to get beyond words.
Yeah.
The great potential of poetry, and poetry is impossible as a form. That needs to be acknowledged straight off. It's impossible because you're trying to use words that everybody uses and that are used and misused and abused and cheapened and knocked around with and changed, and you can't write like Shelley now. However much you feel like that, you're just not going to. You can't speak. The atmosphere won't let that speech take place yet. Might do again. What was I saying? I've lost my.
well, how it's really helped your teaching, just this refined awareness of words.
Of words, that's right, and the Buddha being aware of using words. And that poetry's great wager is to use words to get beyond words, to say something that rings beyond words. You know, you read a Frost poem like, I don't know, you know, stopping by woods and snowy evening, and miles to go before I sleep, and you think, this means everything. He said, didn't he, famously, why not have it mean everything? And, you know, that's impossible. You can't have anything mean everything. And yet poetry of all forms has the capacity at its rare best to speak beyond itself, to make the space around it shine with meaning. Now, I think that's probably the closest you ever get to the Buddha's speech. That, because you know, you read accounts of the Buddha speaking to somebody and they gain enlightenment straight away. And you read it and you go, okay, it hasn't happened to me. You know what I mean? Something about his presence, his speech, must have been like reading great poetry. I mean, I don't mean that in a literal way. But. So I think it's deepened my own use of speech. And it's given me, I need a place to leave the world. In my Buddhist life, just like you, and not as much as you, but I've taken on more and more responsibility. And I need to leave the world. I need a dream time. I need to get out of here. I think we all do, us human beings. We have things to do, places to go. We have duties and social masks and all that sort of thing. But I need to leave the world. I think it's a great need to leave the world, but I want to leave the world and come back deepened by that leaving, come back refreshed by that leaving. Because otherwise you just leave the world and you just get into some trivial nonsense and come back even more innovative than you were before. Poetry is a wonderful way, one of the great ways of leaving the world, and by leaving it, gaining more when I come back.
And then sharing it with others.
And then sharing that with others, yeah. And sharing it with others is as important.
It's very important.
Yeah. It's such a shame that poetry has lost its audience. Such a shame. Because it is trying to talk to everyone about life. Why not have it mean everything? I think anyone who's trying to write a poem, that's where you should start. Why not have it mean everything? And of course that's impossible, but hey, that's the only thing that's worth doing.
That's a lovely place to stop there. So thank you very, very much, my friend.